The cypress roots jutted from black water like broken fingers, while Spanish moss draped the Florida swampland in funeral shrouds that muffled even the screams. Somewhere in that maze of water and shadow, rope cut into white flesh as alligator eyes reflected torchlight like floating coins. The year was 1829, and in the depths of the Everglades, a man named Cato was about to serve justice one bite at a time. This is the story of how America's most brutal institution created its own perfect executioner. The Whitfield Plantation, sprawled across 3,000 acres of sugarcane fields outside Street Augustine, where the Atlantic breeze carried salt and suffering in equal measure. Master Thomas Whitfield ruled his domain with calculated cruelty, believing that fear kept his 200 enslaved souls productive. His overseer's whip sang daily hymns of discipline, while the punishment swamp behind the main house swallowed screams that grew too loud for polite society. Cato had survived 22 years under Whitfield's boot, his back a roadmap of scars that told stories in raised flesh. Born into bondage on a Carolina rice plantation, he'd been sold south when his first master died, passed between owners like damaged goods, until Whitfield purchased him for his knowledge of waterways and his ability to track runaway slaves through terrain that claimed white men's lives. The irony was exquisite. Whitfield had bought his own destruction. On the morning of September 15, 1829, Cato stood waist-deep in swamp water, supposedly hunting escaped slaves who'd fled into the cypress maze 3 days prior. But the ropes coiled around his shoulder weren't meant for runaways. The gator bait in his sack wasn't for fishing, and the fury burning in his chest had been 22 years in the making. Where are you watching this story unfold right now? What time is it in your part of the world? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if tales of justice served cold fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next has been buried in courthouse records for almost 2 centuries. The plantation bell had rung at 4:30 that morning, calling field hands to another day of cutting cane under the Florida Sunday. But Cato heard something else in that bronze voice. He heard his daughter Patience screaming as Whitfield sold her to a passing trader the week before, heard his wife Mercy sobbing into corn husks after the master took what he wanted from their cabin, heard 22 years of swallowed words, bitten tongues, and buried rage finally clawing toward the surface. Whitfield found him exactly where Cato knew he would. The master rode his bay stallion along the elevated path that skirted the swamp's edge, checking on his tracker's progress. The morning mist clung to the water like guilty secrets, while somewhere in the distance, a bull alligator's bellow echoed through the trees like thunder made flesh. "Any sign of them, boy?" Whitfield called out, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who'd never questioned his right to own other human beings. Cato waded closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Yes, sir, Master Whitfield." "Found their trail leading deeper into the swamp, but there's something else you need to see." The master dismounted, tying his horse to a cypress knee. His boots squelched in the muddy bank as he approached the water's edge, expensive leather meeting primordial ooze. He carried a rifle, naturally, but 22 years of submission had taught him to see Cato as furniture rather than threat. "What is it?" Whitfield demanded, peering into the dark water where Cato pointed. "Right there, sir, in the shallows." When Whitfield leaned forward to look, Cato's rope moved like a striking snake. The noose dropped over the master's head, pulled tight before shock could become resistance. Whitfield's rifle tumbled into the water with a splash that sent ripples across the still surface, while his hands clawed at hemp that bit deeper with every struggle. But here's what the historical records don't capture: the other enslaved workers who heard splashing from across the cane fields, the overseer who noticed Whitfield's horse returning riderless, but waited until after lunch to investigate, the house slaves who saw Cato emerge from the swamp hours later, clothes torn and muddy, but offered him fresh water without asking questions. What would you have done, watching your owner disappear into water that had swallowed runaways for decades? The morning sun climbed higher as Cato began the long process of dragging Thomas Whitfield deeper into a world where white skin held no currency and screaming brought only echoes. The water tasted of iron and secrets as Cato dragged his burden deeper into the swamp, each step stirring up clouds of sediment that turned the world the color of dried blood. Above, the canopy closed like a cathedral roof, filtering sunlight into green-gold shafts that danced across the surface tension. The only sounds were Whitfield's muffled protests and the steady splash of boots finding purchase on submerged logs. This wasn't impulse, this was engineering, 22 years in the making. Cato had mapped every channel, every sinkhole, every alligator nest in these 10 square miles of wetland. He knew where the water ran deepest, where cypress roots formed natural cages, where the big bulls liked to sun themselves on fallen timber. More importantly, he knew which areas the other overseers avoided, which paths led to dead ends, which sounds carried, and which were swallowed by the vast green silence. From a plantation record dated September 10th, 1829, Negro Cato reports 3 runaways headed southeast into the cypress marsh. Tracking party dispatched, but returned empty-handed. Terrain deemed too hazardous for extended pursuit. Whitfield had stopped struggling after the first half-mile, his energy spent fighting rope that only tightened with resistance. Now he moved like a sleepwalker, stumbling through knee-deep water, while Cato guided him with gentle tugs. The master's fine cotton shirt clung to his skin, transparent with sweat and marsh water, while his leather boots filled and emptied with each forced step. "You don't understand what you're doing," Whitfield gasped, his voice barely audible above the symphony of insects and tree frogs. "They'll hang you. They'll hang every last one of you." Cato didn't reply. Words were for people who had choices. The swamp had its own logic, its own justice system that recognized no difference between white skin and black. Here, alligators didn't read bills of sale. Here, water moccasins struck whoever disturbed their rest. Here, the only law was survival, and Cato had learned its lessons better than any man alive. They reached the first checkpoint at 9:45, a partially submerged cypress that had fallen across a narrow channel, creating a natural bridge. Cato had used this spot before, dragging captured runaways back to the plantation for punishment. The irony wasn't lost on him as he forced Whitfield to crawl across the slippery bark, rope trailing behind him like a leash. But something had changed in the ecosystem since Cato's last visit. The water level had dropped 2 feet, revealing muddy banks scarred with claw marks and littered with bone fragments. A massive bull alligator had claimed this territory, turning the shallow pool into a killing ground where smaller creatures came to drink and never left. Perfect symmetry. The hunter had become the hunting ground. Cato secured the rope to a sturdy branch and studied his prisoner with the detached interest of a scientist examining specimens. Whitfield sat in the mud, chest heaving, eyes darting between the water and his captor's face. For the first time in his life, the master was seeing an enslaved person as fully human, dangerous, intelligent, and utterly beyond his control. "My wife will send search parties," Whitfield whispered. "They'll find us." "Your wife is entertaining the preacher," Cato replied, his voice carrying no emotion. "Told the house slaves not to disturb them until evening prayers. Search parties won't form until tomorrow, and they won't search here. Too dangerous for white men." The statement hung in the humid air, like Spanish moss, heavy with implications. Mrs. Whitfield's weekly theological discussions with Reverend Morrison were common knowledge in the slave quarters, though the theology involved had little to do with Scripture. But here's what transforms this from simple revenge into something darker. Cato had been planning this moment since his daughter's sale, but the trigger wasn't her screaming. It wasn't even his wife's violation. The trigger was finding Patience's favorite rag doll floating in the punishment pond, thrown there by Whitfield after the sale as a casual afterthought. Some cruelties cut deeper than flesh. The sun reached its zenith, turning the swamp into a greenhouse where every breath felt stolen from someone else's lungs. Somewhere in the distance, a bull alligator's territorial bellow echoed between the trees, deep, primal, announcing that feeding time was approaching. The midday heat pressed down like a physical weight, while Cato methodically prepared his trap, each movement deliberate as a surgeon arranging instruments. The rope burns on Whitfield's neck had begun to weep, mixing blood with sweat that attracted clouds of mosquitoes hungry for their own justice. 20 feet away, the bull alligator's eyes broke the surface like twin periscopes, watching, waiting, calculating distances with prehistoric patience. This wasn't madness, this was mathematics, solved in flesh and fear. Cato had spent 3 weeks studying the big bull's hunting patterns, noting how it positioned itself near the fallen cypress during the hottest part of the day. Alligators were ambush predators. Explosive bursts of violence preceded by hours of motionless observation. They struck when prey entered the kill zone, typically within 8 feet of their hiding spot. The rope Cato had brought measured exactly 10 feet close enough to attract attention, far enough to require effort. The master sat bound against the cypress trunk, his expensive clothes now indistinguishable from swamp debris. Mud caked his hair, turning his silver locks the color of dried blood. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each exhale a small prayer to a god who seemed to have abandoned this green cathedral to older, hungrier deities. "I can make you rich," Whitfield whispered, his voice cracking like autumn leaves. "Free papers, money, passage north, whatever you want." Cato's laugh was soft as settling sediment. "What I want, you sold to a trader from Georgia." The statement carried the weight of absolute finality. Some transactions couldn't be reversed with gold or promises. Some wounds cut too deep for anything but reciprocal bleeding. Patience, his daughter, his heart walking outside his body, was 300 miles away by now, learning new names for her tears in a stranger's cotton fields. From the diary of Sarah Whitfield, September 15th, 1829. Thomas departed early to check the swamp trackers. Reverend Morrison stayed for extended prayer session. The Lord works in mysterious ways. But here's what the historical record couldn't capture: the network of eyes and ears that had been watching, waiting, hoping for exactly this moment. Jacob, the stable hand, had seen Cato pocket the extra rope. Miriam, the cook, had noticed him collecting scraps of raw meat. Old Samuel, the blacksmith, had watched him sharpen a knife that wasn't meant for cutting cane. None of them said a word. The conspiracy of silence extended beyond the slave quarters into the main house itself. Mrs. Whitfield's afternoon devotions with the preacher had become legendary among the staff, lasting exactly as long as her husband's swamp expeditions. The timing wasn't coincidental. Even cruelty had its rhythms, its patterns that could be exploited by those patient enough to observe. Cato adjusted Whitfield's position, angling him toward the water like bait on a hook. The rope around the master's chest was loose enough to allow movement, tight enough to prevent escape. Physics and psychology working in perfect harmony. The more Whitfield struggled toward freedom, the closer he'd move to the kill zone. "They'll come looking," Whitfield said, though his voice carried less conviction now. "Search parties, dogs, soldiers if necessary." "Dogs can't track through water," Cato replied, checking his knots with professional precision. "Soldiers won't enter the deep swamp. And search parties?" He gestured toward the maze of channels and sinkholes stretching to the horizon. "This place swallows secrets. Been doing it long before your kind arrived." The truth was more complex. Cato knew search parties would come eventually, but he also knew their limitations. White overseers feared the swamp's reputation for claiming lives, preferring to wait for bodies to surface rather than risk recovery missions. By the time they organized expeditions, evidence would have dissolved into the ecosystem. processed by scavengers into bone fragments scattered across 10 square miles of wetland. Nature was the perfect accomplice. The bull alligator had begun moving, its massive body creating V-shaped ripples as it adjusted position. 12 feet long, easily 400 pounds, with jaws that could snap a man's spine like kindling. Cato had watched it take a wild boar the previous week, death arriving in less than 3 seconds of thrashing water. But speed wasn't the point. The point was inevitability. "You're making a mistake," Whitfield pleaded, his eyes tracking the alligator's approach. "I'm not your enemy. The system is your enemy. You're the system," Cato interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of 22 years' worth of swallowed responses. "You're every bill of sale, every auction block, every screaming child torn from their mother's arms. You're the reason my daughter calls another man master." The words hung in the humid air like Spanish moss, heavy with accumulated grief. What does justice look like when law itself is the crime? The afternoon sun began its descent toward the tree line, and somewhere in the green cathedral, ancient appetite stirred to wakefulness. The shadows lengthened like accusing fingers as the bull alligator settled into hunting position, its prehistoric form now indistinguishable from the rotting log it mimicked. Only the occasional blink betrayed life in those ancient eyes, amber coins that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless meals. Whitfield's breathing had grown ragged, each inhale a battle against the rope that bit deeper with every panicked movement. Time moved differently in the swamp, measured not in minutes, but in heartbeats and the gradual shift of light through Spanish moss. Cato sat on a cypress knee 10 feet from his prisoner, close enough to prevent escape, far enough to avoid the inevitable thrashing. His knife rested across his knees, not for violence, but for the final cut that would free Whitfield to meet his fate unencumbered. 22 years of forced servitude had taught him patience above all virtues, the ability to wait, to endure, to let time work its slow alchemy on suffering. "My children will remember me," Whitfield whispered, his voice barely audible above the insect chorus. "They'll know their father died fighting savages in the wilderness." "Your children will inherit a plantation built on bones," Cato replied, his tone carrying no more emotion than if discussing weather. "They'll profit from the screams you've harvested. They'll be exactly what you made them." The truth settled between them like sediment, heavy and inescapable. Thomas Whitfield Jr. was already 14, already learning to see human property as numbers in ledger books. Little Margaret, only 10, had watched her father's punishments with the detached curiosity of a child born into systemic cruelty. Some sins echoed across generations. But here's what transforms this from simple execution into something deeper. Cato had been present at both children's births, holding lanterns while the doctor worked, cleaning blood from floors that would later be stained with different kinds of suffering. He'd carved their first toys, told them stories, watched them take their first steps on land worked by people they'd never see as human. The personal and political couldn't be separated. They were the same wound, bleeding in different directions. From a letter dated September 20th, 1829, Street, Augustine Parish Records. Master Thomas Whitfield reported missing. Last seen heading into marsh to track runaways. Search expedition planned pending weather conditions. The plantation had noticed Whitfield's absence, naturally, but institutional inertia worked in Cato's favor. Mrs. Whitfield explained her husband's absence as an extended tracking mission, buying precious hours before questions became investigations. The other enslaved workers maintained their routines with the mechanical precision of people who understood that survival meant invisibility. The afternoon heat began its gradual retreat, though the humidity remained thick enough to chew. Somewhere in the canopy above, a red-shouldered hawk called out its territorial claim, the sound sharp as breaking glass in the green cathedral silence. The bull alligator adjusted its position slightly, a movement so subtle it might have been settling sediment rather than living muscle. Whitfield had begun to understand his situation's mathematics. The rope prevented retreat. The water blocked escape routes. The alligator eliminated negotiation. He existed in a space between choices, where every option led to the same conclusion through different paths. You could still walk away, he offered, desperation giving his voice an almost childlike quality. Untie the rope and disappear. No one would know you were involved. Cato's laugh was soft as settling marsh gas. Walk away to what? Another master? Another auction block? Another daughter sold south? He shook his head slowly. Some doors only open one direction. The statement carried the weight of inevitability. Even if Cato survived this encounter, even if he escaped into the deep swamp and lived wild among the Seminoles, he could never return to the world of plantations and bills of sale. This act had transformed him from property into outlaw, from victim into agent of his own justice. The transformation was irreversible as death itself. The bull alligator's tail twitched once, a barely perceptible movement that sent ripples across the still water. Feeding time approached with the methodical certainty of sunrise, governed by instincts older than human civilization. But patience had its own rewards. The first scream would come at sunset, when shadows gave the swamp permission to reveal its hungers. The cypress trees stood like silent sentinels as the sun began its descent, their bark scarred by decades of high water and hurricane winds that had carried away weaker things. A great blue heron picked its way through the shallows, 50 yards distant, each step deliberate as a funeral march, while somewhere deeper in the swamp, a wood duck called out warnings that echoed like prayers in an empty church. The bull alligator had gone completely still, transformed into living death that waited with prehistoric patience. What the plantation records would never document was how many people knew exactly where Thomas Whitfield had gone to die. Samuel the blacksmith had watched Cato test rope strength that morning, noting how the hemp held firm under 200 pounds of pulling force. Miriam in the kitchen had seen him wrap raw chicken scraps in canvas, the kind of bait used for tracking dangerous animals through hostile terrain. Even young Timothy, barely 16 and working the stables, had observed the way Cato studied the master's riding patterns, memorizing routes and timing with the precision of a military strategist. None of them asked questions. Some knowledge was too dangerous for words. The conspiracy extended beyond the slave quarters into the main house itself, where Mrs. Whitfield entertained Reverend Morrison with theological discussions that lasted exactly as long as her husband's tracking expeditions. The staff understood the rhythm afternoon prayers that sounded remarkably like bed springs, evening devotions that required locked doors and drawn curtains. "You hear that?" Whitfield whispered, his head turning toward distant splashing sounds. Cato listened. Someone was moving through the swamp, but the sounds came from the wrong direction, west, toward the plantation, rather than east, toward the deep marsh. Whoever approached was following established paths, making noise, announcing their presence like tourists rather than hunters. "Search party?" Whitfield's voice carried desperate hope. "Moses," Cato replied after a moment of analysis, "bringing your evening meal to the quarters. Same route, same time, every day for 15 years. The hope died in Whitfield's eyes like a snuffed candle. Moses, the cook's assistant, followed the elevated boardwalk that connected the main house to the slave quarters, carrying supper in covered pots that steamed in the cooling air. His route passed within a quarter-mile of their position, close enough to hear if someone screamed loud enough. But Moses was 73 years old, nearly blind, and had survived 5 decades of bondage by perfecting the art of seeing nothing, hearing nothing, knowing nothing that might endanger the delicate balance keeping him alive. From the personal journal of Dr. Marcus Webb, visiting physician, September 16, 1829, attended plantation for routine medical inspection. Master Whitfield, absent on tracking expedition. Household reports excellent discipline among the slaves. No signs of unrest or conspiracy. The irony was perfect. Dr. Webb had examined the same people who'd spent days preparing for Whitfield's execution, checking their health while they planned their owner's death. He'd found them remarkably calm, their vital signs normal, their demeanor appropriately subservient. They'd passed the test of looking innocent while being guilty. The bull alligator's eyes blinked once, a movement so subtle it might have been sunlight shifting through Spanish moss. But Cato recognized the signs, the slight adjustment of position, the increased frequency of breathing, the way the massive tail swept almost imperceptibly from side to side. Hunger was awakening. "I freed 3 slaves last Christmas," Whitfield said suddenly, his voice carrying the desperation of a man grasping at moral straws. "Gave them papers, money for passage north. You freed property that was too old to work," Cato corrected. "Moses' brother, Sarah with the withered arm, Jacob who lost his leg in the mill accident. You freed broken tools." The truth hung between them like Spanish moss, impossible to ignore. Whitfield's Christmas charity had been calculated economics, disposing of human property that cost more to maintain than it produced. The freed slaves were all approaching death anyway, their emancipation more about saving food costs than acknowledging humanity. Some gifts came wrapped in cruelty, but here's what transforms the moment from revenge into revelation. Cato pulled out a piece of paper, water-stained but readable, that he'd carried for 3 months. It was Patience's bill of sale, documenting her purchase price, her physical description, her transfer of ownership like livestock changing hands. $800, Cato read aloud. "One Negro girl, approximately 12 years, good teeth, no visible defects, sold to Martin Graves of Savannah for transport to Georgia cotton plantations." Whitfield's face went ashen as he recognized the document. "You can't read. Your daughter taught me. Every evening after chores. Said letters were the only things you couldn't buy or sell." Cato folded the paper carefully, returning it to his pocket. She was wrong about that too. The revelation shattered another assumption. Literate slaves were dangerous slaves, capable of forging passes, reading abolition literature, understanding the legal framework of their own oppression. Masters went to great lengths to keep their human property ignorant, but knowledge, like water, found its own pathways. The shadows grew longer, and somewhere in the green cathedral, ancient appetites prepared for evening prayers. What would you choose? The moral high ground or the satisfaction of watching evil devour itself? The bull alligator's first movement would come at sunset, when darkness gave the swamp permission to reveal its hungers. The first ripple broke the water's surface at 5:47 in the afternoon, a concentric circle spreading outward from where the bull alligator's snout had tested the air for scent. The smell of fear had grown thick as honey in the humid atmosphere, mixing with the metallic tang of blood from Whitfield's rope burns and the sweet decay of fallen magnolia blossoms that carpeted the swamp floor. Cato watched the mathematics of predation unfold with the detached interest of someone who'd studied death from both sides of the equation. Every living thing in the swamp understood the approaching climax, except the man tied to the cypress tree. The bull alligator moved with hydraulic precision, its massive body cutting through water dark as coffee grounds, while ancient eyes remained fixed on the pale figure struggling against hemp restraints. 400 pounds of muscle and bone, powered by instincts that had survived the extinction of dinosaurs, the rise and fall of civilizations, the entire bloody pageant of human history reduced to a simple calculation. Hunger plus opportunity equals inevitability. Whitfield had begun to shake, though whether from terror or the dropping temperature was impossible to determine. His expensive cotton shirt clung to his torso like a burial shroud, transparent with sweat and marsh water that had seeped through the fabric's weave. The rope around his chest rose and fell with increasingly rapid breathing, each exhale a small prayer to gods who seemed to have abandoned this green cathedral to older, hungrier deities. "It doesn't have to end this way," he whispered, his voice cracking like autumn leaves. We could work together, reform the system from within. Cato's laugh was soft as settling sediment. 22 years too late for reform. The statement carried the weight of accumulated suffering. Every scar on Cato's back told a story of systematic brutality disguised as economic necessity. Every missing tooth spoke of punishments designed to break spirits along with bones. Every night spent listening to his wife sob after Whitfield's visits had carved deeper channels in his capacity for mercy. Some wounds couldn't heal around the knife. From the Street Augustine Parish death records, September 17, 1829. Thomas Whitfield, age 43, presumed deceased, circumstances unknown. Body not recovered. Funeral services postponed pending investigation. But here's what the official records couldn't capture: the speed with which life reorganized itself around Whitfield's absence. Mrs. Whitfield's grief lasted exactly as long as her husband's life insurance required, her mourning period measured in legal consultations rather than tears. The plantation's daily rhythms continued without interruption. Cotton still needed picking, cane still required cutting, and human property still demanded management. Masters were replaceable. Suffering was eternal. The bull alligator had closed to within 15 feet, its approach so gradual that displacement seemed like natural current rather than deliberate stalking. Only the eyes gave it away unblinking amber coins that reflected firelight like windows into prehistoric hunger. The massive tail swept back and forth beneath the surface, creating pressure waves that Cato felt against his legs like the heartbeat of the swamp itself. "My children," Whitfield pleaded, his voice barely audible above the symphony of insects and tree frogs. "They're innocent. They don't deserve to lose their father." "Neither did mine," Cato replied, his tone carrying no more emotion than if discussing weather. "Neither did the 100 others you've sold south. Neither did their children, or their children's children, stretching back through generations of broken families." The mathematics were inescapable. Whitfield's death would create 2 orphans, but his life had created hundreds, maybe thousands, separating families with the casual efficiency of a man dispersing livestock to maximize profit. The scales of justice demanded more than individual suffering. They demanded institutional reckoning. Some debts could only be paid in blood. The rope began to fray where it rubbed against cypress bark, individual hemp fibers separating under constant tension, like a country slowly tearing itself apart. Cato had calculated this too. The precise point where Whitfield's struggles would weaken his restraints enough to allow movement but not escape. Physics and psychology working in perfect harmony, the illusion of hope serving as bait for deeper despair. The bull alligator's breathing had changed, faster now. Anticipating, its massive jaws parted slightly, revealing teeth like yellow daggers that had evolved for gripping rather than cutting. Death would come through drowning and crushing, rather than blood loss. A mercy of sorts. Though mercy was measured differently in the Green Cathedral. But here's the moment that transforms everything. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the swamp in shades of blood and gold, a child's voice echoed across the water, high and clear and heartbreakingly familiar, calling "Papa, Papa" from somewhere near the plantation's edge. Whitfield's face crumpled like wet paper. "Margaret, my baby girl." The voice came again, closer now, followed by splashing sounds as small feet navigated the shallow channels. 10-year-old Margaret Whitfield, worried about her father's extended absence, had convinced her brother to help search the swamp's edge, despite explicit orders to stay near the house. Cato's hand tightened on his knife, but not for violence, for the choice between justice and innocence. What happens when revenge requires destroying the very innocence it claims to protect? The bull alligator's attack would come at sunset, but now, sunset carried the laughter of children who had no idea they were walking toward their father's execution. The children's voices grew closer through the gathering dusk, their laughter bouncing off cypress trunks like echoes of a world where fathers came home for supper and bedtime stories. Margaret's white dress flashed between the trees like a ghost made flesh, while her brother Thomas Jr. followed with the cautious steps of someone old enough to sense danger, but too young to name it. The bull alligator's massive head swiveled toward the new sounds, ancient instincts calculating fresh possibilities in the mathematics of hunger. This was the moment Cato had never planned for when justice collided with innocence in the green cathedral's deepest shadows. "Papa!" Margaret called again, her voice carrying the absolute trust of a child who believed the world existed to protect her rather than profit from her pain. She splashed through ankle-deep water, her patent leather shoes squelching in mud that had swallowed screams for generations. Behind her, Thomas Jr. carried a lantern that cast dancing shadows across the water, turning cypress roots into grasping fingers and Spanish moss into funeral shrouds. Whitfield's face had transformed into a mask of parental terror that transcended his own approaching death. "Margaret, stay back. Don't come any closer." But his shouts only drew her forward, guided by filial devotion that couldn't distinguish between rescue and witness. She waded deeper into the swamp, following her father's voice toward a scene that would shatter her childhood like crystal dropped on stone. Cato faced an impossible calculation. Let the children discover their father's execution, traumatizing them forever. Or intervene, sacrificing 22 years of accumulated justice for the sake of innocence that would inherit the plantation's cruelties anyway. The bull alligator made the decision for him. The massive predator had identified Margaret as the easier target, smaller, slower, unaware of danger that approached with hydraulic precision through water dark as old blood. Its tail swept once, propelling 400 pounds of prehistoric hunger toward patent leather shoes and white cotton innocence. Cato moved without thinking, muscle memory overriding 22 years of rage. His knife cut through Whitfield's restraints in a single stroke, while his voice boomed across the water with command authority learned from decades of managing field hands. "Thomas, take your sister and run. Now!" The urgency in his tone penetrated teenage confusion. Thomas Jr. grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled her toward higher ground, their lantern swinging wild arcs of light across the chaos erupting in the shallows. Margaret's protests, "But Papa, Papa," faded into distance, measured by survival rather than affection. Whitfield, freed but disoriented, stumbled toward his children with the desperate energy of a man granted unexpected reprieve. The rope burns around his neck wept blood that attracted clouds of mosquitoes, while his waterlogged boots fought for purchase on submerged logs, slick with algae and decay. But freedom was an illusion measured in heartbeats. The bull alligator had committed to its attack trajectory, momentum carrying it through water that exploded into foam and fury. 12 feet of prehistoric hunger struck like a runaway locomotive, jaws snapping shut on empty air where Margaret had stood moments before. The miss only redirected its attention toward the larger target thrashing through the shallows. Whitfield never saw it coming. The impact sounded like a tree falling, the crack of breaking bones mixing with splashing water, and a scream that would echo through Cato's dreams for the rest of his life. The master's body disappeared beneath the surface in a violent maelstrom of churning mud and blood that turned the peaceful swamp into a vision of primordial chaos. From the sworn testimony of Thomas Whitfield, Jr., October 1st, 1829, "We heard Papa calling for help. When we reached the swamp, we saw the Negro Cato trying to rescue him from an alligator attack. Cato shouted warnings and cut Papa free from debris that had trapped him. The beast was too large. Papa was taken before anyone could intervene." The official record would show Cato as hero rather than executioner, the children's testimony protecting him from charges that would have meant public hanging in the town square. Sometimes truth served justice better than lies, even when truth required editing the deeper mathematics of revenge. But here's what the courthouse records couldn't document. The look in Cato's eyes as he watched 22 years of accumulated rage disappear beneath dark water. Relief mixed with loss, justice tempered by the knowledge that some victories taste like defeat when innocence pays the price. The swamp fell silent, except for settling ripples and the distant sound of children sobbing in their brother's arms. What happens when mercy and justice become the same terrible choice? The bull alligator would surface again at midnight, ancient appetites finally satisfied, while somewhere in the darkness, a freed slave prepared for consequences that might prove worse than bondage. The lantern light flickered across dark water that had returned to mirror stillness, reflecting Spanish moss and starlight with the indifference of a surface that had swallowed screams for centuries. Cato stood waist-deep in the shallows, his clothes torn and bloody from debris kicked up during the alligator's feeding frenzy, while 50 yards away, the Whitfield children huddled together on higher ground like survivors of a shipwreck. The official story was already writing itself in their traumatized minds. Brave Cato, attempting rescue, vicious alligator claiming its prize, tragic accident in the unforgiving swamp. History would remember him as a hero, but heroes carry different burdens than executioners. Thomas Jr. approached first, his 14-year-old frame trying to project adult authority, while his voice cracked with residual terror. "Cato, we need to get back to the house. Mama will be worried sick." The boy's concern was genuine, untainted by the racial calculations that would poison his thinking in years to come. For now, he saw only the man who'd tried to save his father from the swamp's ancient hungers. Margaret clung to her brother's hand, her white dress stained with mud and tears, her child's mind struggling to process violence that existed beyond fairy tale frameworks. "Yes, sir, Master Thomas," Cato replied, the words tasting like copper pennies in his mouth. "We should hurry. This water ain't safe after dark." But safety was relative in a world where justice wore alligator teeth and mercy demanded becoming the monster you'd been accused of being all along. Cato had saved the children from witnessing their father's execution, but in doing so, he'd condemned himself to a lifetime of performing heroism he didn't feel. From the Street Augustine Parish investigation report, October 5, 1829, witness testimony confirms Negro slave Cato attempted rescue of Master Whitfield from alligator attack. Children present corroborate story. No evidence of foul play. Death ruled accidental. Slave commended for bravery. The irony was perfect. 22 years of planning the perfect murder, only to be officially praised for failing to complete it. The system that had brutalized him now celebrated his supposed loyalty, transforming rage into heroism through bureaucratic sleight of hand. Mrs. Whitfield would likely reward him with extra rations, better clothing, perhaps even a small cabin of his own. The thought made his stomach turn. They walked back through cypress shadows that seemed to lean inward like conspirators sharing secrets. Margaret had stopped crying, but maintained silence that spoke volumes about trauma's ability to steal words from children who'd believed themselves safe. Thomas Jr. carried the lantern with steady hands, but Cato noticed how the boy's eyes darted between shadows, searching for threats that might emerge from water dark as old blood. The plantation house appeared through the trees like a ship floating on an ocean of cotton fields, its windows glowing with lamplight that promised warmth and safety to those privileged enough to enter through the front door. Cato would use the kitchen entrance, naturally, reporting to Mrs. Whitfield with hat in hand and eyes downcast, playing the role of faithful servant who'd risked his life for his master's family. But here's what transforms the moment from simple survival into something deeper. As they approached the house, Margaret tugged on Cato's sleeve with the fearless intimacy of childhood. "Thank you for trying to save Papa," she whispered. "Mama says you're a good man." The words hit harder than any whip ever had. Good man. As if goodness could be measured in failed executions and preserved innocence. As if heroism meant swallowing justice for the sake of those who would inherit the very system he'd tried to destroy. "Yes, miss," he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos churning in his chest. "Your papa was a good master. I'm sorry we couldn't bring him home." The lie came easily, practiced through decades of telling white folks what they needed to hear. But this time felt different. This time, the lie served mercy rather than survival, protecting a child's memory of her father from the mathematical brutality that had defined his life. Mrs. Whitfield emerged from the house in a rustle of black silk, her face already arranged in appropriate widow's grief, though her husband had been missing for less than 8 hours. Behind her, Reverend Morrison adjusted his collar with the practiced discretion of a man accustomed to consoling bereaved wives in private consultation. "Children, thank God you're safe." She gathered them against her bosom with theatrical precision, while her eyes sought Cato's face over their heads. "Tell me what happened." The children's testimony would seal his reputation as a hero and ensure his continued bondage. Their gratitude would become his chains, their innocence, the lock that kept him trapped in a performance of loyalty he neither felt nor deserved. But some performances, once begun, must be played to their conclusion. The alternative was hanging from the town square oak tree while crowds cheered justice finally served. What price would you pay to preserve a child's faith in goodness? Even now, 2 centuries later, locals claim you can sometimes hear splashing in the old Whitfield swamp at midnight, though whether it's alligators feeding or guilty consciences drowning remains a matter of interpretation. The courthouse bells chimed 9 times on the morning of October 15th, as Cato stood before Judge Harrison's bench, his Sunday clothes borrowed from the preacher and his hands folded in the posture of humility that had kept him alive for 22 years. The packed courtroom buzzed with the energy of spectacle, white faces eager to witness the rare ceremony of a slave receiving official commendation for heroism. Behind him, the Whitfield family occupied the front row, like mourners at a funeral for justice itself, their presence lending weight to testimony that would transform executioner into saint. This was how history rewrote itself, one lie at a time, until truth became indistinguishable from performance. Judge Harrison adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat with the authority of a man accustomed to determining guilt and innocence through legal theater, rather than actual investigation. The gavel in his hand might as well have been a stage prop, polished wood that would soon strike the final note in Cato's transformation from property to hero. Cato, belonging to the estate of the late Thomas Whitfield, the judge intoned, his voice carrying across the courtroom like Sunday sermon. "You stand before this court not as accused, but as exemplar of loyalty and courage in the face of mortal danger." The words tasted like poison disguised as communion wine. Cato kept his expression neutral, decades of practice helping him maintain the mask of grateful servitude, while his soul screamed against the injustice of being praised for failing to complete justice. Mrs. Whitfield rose from her seat, black silk rustling like wings of prey. "Your Honor, if I may speak on behalf of my late husband's estate." Her voice carried the practiced tremor of professional grief. Though neighbors whispered, she'd been seen laughing with Reverend Morrison less than a week after the funeral. "Cato risked his own life attempting to save my dear Thomas from that terrible beast. My children are alive today because of his bravery. I cannot imagine a more faithful servant." From the Street Augustine Parish Court Records, October 15th, 1829. Negro slave Cato awarded Certificate of Merit for heroic conduct. Mrs. Sarah Whitfield petitions court to grant increased privileges in recognition of service. Petition approved. The certificate would hang in the plantation's main hall, visible to every visitor who needed reassurance that the peculiar institution produced loyalty alongside cotton and sugar. Cato's heroism would become advertising for slavery itself, proof that proper treatment created devoted servants willing to die for their masters. But here's what the official ceremony couldn't capture: the weight of carrying unfinished business in his chest, like a tumor that grew heavier with every breath. Justice deferred was justice denied, and every night brought dreams where Thomas Whitfield rose from dark water to remind him that some debts could never be forgiven, only postponed. The crowd applauded as Judge Harrison presented the certificate, their enthusiasm mixing genuine admiration with relief that their property remained loyal despite obvious provocation. Cato accepted the document with appropriate gratitude, his scarred hands trembling not from emotion, but from the effort required to maintain performance when every fiber of his being screamed for the satisfaction of completed revenge. Young Margaret Whitfield approached after the ceremony, her small hand tugging at his sleeve with the fearless affection of innocence preserved. "Cato, Mama says you're going to live in the big cabin now. Will you teach me to fish like you taught Papa?" The question hit like a physical blow. Whitfield had never learned to fish from Cato. He'd ordered him to track runaway slaves through deadly swamp water. But children's memories edited trauma into bearable narratives, transforming executioner into teacher, predator into protector. "Yes, miss," he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos churning beneath. "Your papa would have wanted that." The lie came easily, because lies were the currency of survival. But this lie carried different weight, not protecting himself from punishment, but protecting a child from truth that would shatter her world like crystal dropped on stone. As the courtroom emptied and congratulations faded into memory, Cato walked back toward the plantation that would remain his prison despite official heroism. The certificate in his pocket felt heavier than chains, binding him to a performance of loyalty that must continue until death granted release from the burden of false glory. Behind him, the courthouse clock struck 10, marking another hour in a life measured by postponed justice and preserved innocence. Somewhere in the swamp, alligators basked in afternoon sun that warmed scales older than human civilization, patient as the grave, and twice as hungry. The debt remained unpaid, the scales remained unbalanced, and in the green cathedral where justice wore reptilian teeth, some hungers were eternal as Spanish moss and twice as patient. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.